Today, I think Secretary General of Bangladesh has joined with us, Mr. Advocate Abur Rokib. Welcome, sir. Today is the 13th day. Half of the sessions are over, so another 9 sessions for us. Today we have a very interesting topic, that is fundamentals of jumping, bounding, and plyometrics. Been conducted by Mr. Volker Hermann, the High Performance Director of AFI. You all don't need another introduction about him. We introduced him many days. So I request Mr. Volker Hermann to continue with the session today.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Today's topic will be about plyometrics and especially the fundamentals of bounding. So it's not directly related to one specific discipline like the long jump, the high jump, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of information for all of you, which you later will be able to apply with your athletes on the ground. So let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you can clearly see that. Before we start talking about plyometrics, I just want to have a quick review on what we've learned about muscle action so far. Yeah, remember we have isometric and we have dynamic movements, or the isometric movements also called static movements, and we have different muscle actions. We have a concentric action when the muscle length is actually decreasing, when the muscle is shortening, at the same time activated. And we have an eccentric muscle action when the muscle length is increasing during the activation. And then we have so-called isometric movements where we can't see a change of the muscle length. And that's important for the plyometrics because every jump, or let's say the majority of jumps, they actually consist of a so-called stretch shortening cycle. And as the name stretch shortening already indicates, it's an order of an eccentric movement followed by a concentric movement afterwards. Yeah, so most of the jumping movements, the running and sprinting movements, even in certain parts of the throws, we have so-called stretch shortening cycles. And that means we always have an eccentric muscle action where the muscle is lengthening in the beginning, for example, during the initial phase of the ground contact, during the braking, followed by a concentric muscle action where the muscle is shortening. And during this eccentric movement, our body is able to store energy in the tendons, and this energy afterwards will be added to the force or the muscle power generated during the concentric movement. And that makes the whole movement a bit more efficient. Yeah, again, we have isometric movements in athletics. That's mainly to find in the starting block position because there is no forward or upward movement when you're in the set position. Still, the muscles are activated, especially the glutes and the hamstrings. Then we have a concentric muscle action, like here, if you do a biceps curl or a hamstring curl. Similarly, when you leave the starting blocks, with a push off of the front hip. And most importantly for athletics, especially in the sprinting, running, and jumping events, are the so-called eccentric movements, as you can find them in the acceleration phase or maximum velocity phase of the sprint race, and as you can find them in nature as well. Yes, the reason a kangaroo, for example, is able to jump that high and far is because it's able to store a lot of energy in its relatively long Achilles tendons attached to the ankle joint. Yeah, and in athletics training, we also need to focus a bit more on the eccentric movements, especially in India, since we're knowing that most athletes and coaches here are still utilizing or focusing on the concentric part of the movement, even though this part is not as important as the preceding eccentric phase. So eccentric muscle action is most important for athletics, and it also helps us to prevent injuries. Yeah, if you are conducting a lot of concentric training, most likely you are developing your muscle in a way in which it is not needed afterwards. Since again, the focus should be on eccentric training, and that's something we have to introduce in our daily or weekly training regime as well. We've already discussed this so-called force velocity curve when we talked about strength training. I just want to have a very quick review of that. Yeah, we see here the contraction speed in meters per second, how fast the muscle is actually contracting. And on the x-axis, we have the force, how much force our body is able to generate, or how much force our muscles are able to generate. And you can see, and I'm pretty sure you've all experienced this already, if you have very high rates, if you go for a 1 repetition maximum test, for example, we have very low contraction velocities. On the other hand, if you want to go for high contraction velocities, the added load has to be relatively low, because every additional load, and that's something you have to keep in mind, is slowing the body down. That means if you are doing a lot of resistance training, you're developing the body more towards a strength-orientated aspect rather than a speed-orientated aspect. And this additional load, if you do towing, for example, might have a negative impact not only on your running technique, but also on the way your muscles are generating speed. And remember this slide, we have intramuscular strength training, which usually happens at around 90 to 100% of our 1 repetition maximum. We have power or speed strengths, which happens at around 40 to 60%. And we have reactive strengths, which is not directly related to the 1 repetition maximum. It just means that we're usually not using any additional weight, or if you're doing some boundings with your senior athletes, for example, with weighted vests or so in the beginning of general preparation, it's very small weights in comparison to the weights we're using during a intramuscular strength training or during the eccentric strength training. And remember that if you're conducting an eccentric strength session, that your body is actually able to cope with loads up to 130, sometimes even 140% of your 1 repetition maximum, because we have a negative velocity, and the way the cross bridges are built in between the actin and myosin filaments in your muscle fiber is a bit different, and that enables us again to exceed our 1 repetition maximum and to apply even more strength. And this is one of the aspects of eccentric strength training we have to utilize, especially during plyometric training. And always remember, if you want to develop speed with your athletes, that means we have to train our muscles at specific contraction speeds. And reactive strength, therefore, is for many decades now is considered to be the link between speed or sprinting and strength training, because we have a high impact of coordination here. And reactive strength training, having plyometrics in your training session, might be a very, very good, especially neurological link from strength-oriented sessions to speed-oriented sessions on the other hand. So we can actually use jumps or plyometrics as a specific strength training method, and there are certain advantages to it. If you're conducting plyometric training, that means we have very little additional weight, as you could see in the previous slide, and that means we have a reduced effect of hypertrophy. That means no hypertrophy, there's no growth of the muscle fibers. That means we have a very small weight gain, and that is of course positive when it comes to the so-called relative strength. Relative strength always applies to the strength in relation to your body weight. So if this relative strength is increasing, your athlete actually has a benefit out of the strength training. If you are increasing your strength and you're maintaining your body weight, the impact will be much higher in comparison to a situation where you're improving your strength based on hypertrophy strength training, for example, but at the same time, you're increasing your body weight as well because the muscles are getting bigger. And plyometric training is a huge benefit because it's mainly depending on a neuromuscular improvement. That means the body weight maintains more or less the same. Still, the coordination in between our muscles and in between the motor units within the muscle is improving. And that means that our strength-weight ratio, the relative strength, is increasing, due to an enhanced intra and intermuscular coordination. And some of you probably remember the slide when we were talking about strength training, that it's actually not that easy to activate the fast twitch fibers in our body. Yesterday, we've had a few discussions about this fast twitch fibers, and Mr. Radhakrishnan mentioned that there's a very high chance that the fast twitch fibers can become slow twitch fibers if you're using the wrong training methods. That means if you're doing a lot of endurance training, especially lactic work, or a lot of strength work with relatively low intensities, that we have a high chance that these fast twitch fibers become slow twitch fibers, and this is an irreversible process. So fast twitch fibers actually cannot become, slow twitch fibers cannot become fast twitch fibers. So we have to be very, very careful. And one of the two ways to affect or to activate our fast twitch fibers is to go for very high contraction speeds. We had two options to do so. Either was to have very high rates, above 90% of the 1 repetition maximum, because then the slow twitch fibers alone are not strong enough to move the weight. And the other way to activate the fast twitch fibers was to go for very quick contraction speeds. And plyometric training offers us such a way, because the slow twitch fibers are not fast enough to conduct a drop jump, for example, or a takeoff in the high jump, where we have relatively short ground contact times. So as shorter the ground contact time is, as more fast twitch fibers we need to apply our strength and to generate a positive impulse. So plyometric training is one way to activate your fast twitch fibers and makes the whole movement more efficient and helps to develop your athlete into the right direction. So let's talk a bit more in detail about the stretch shortening cycle. And we have stretch shortening cycles actually all around the body. We have it in the Achilles tendon, and I will discuss this a bit more afterwards, but we also have it in the patellar tendon, that's a knee joint. Even for the hip flexors, we find a stretch shortening cycle. We have it in the pectoralis muscle, for example, for the throwers. And this stretch shortening cycle is actually a very helpful tool provided by nature to make our movements more efficient. Here in this example, we're having a look on the so-called muscle tendon unit of the calf muscle. And you all know that we have the gastrocnemius, the upper part with the two heads, the medial and the lateral head. And below this gastrocnemius, we have the so-called soleus muscle. And these muscles, they insert into the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon then is attached to the calcaneus, that's the heel bone. And you have to think about the muscle and the tendon as one unit, because they're always working together with each other. They are deeply connected, and it's almost impossible to isolate the muscle from the tendon when we're talking about a movement. So when we're discussing the stretch shortening cycle, we always have to talk about the so-called muscle tendon unit, because the action of the muscle is directly influencing the action of the tendon. And in this case, if you think of this left green block as a muscle tendon unit, we see we have the muscle here on the top and we have the tendon on the bottom, very much according to our calf muscle tendon unit here on the left picture. So what happens? If the muscle is contracting, if you're going for a heel raise, for example, your muscle is shortening. That means we have a concentric muscle action and the muscle is shortening. Since we cannot anatomically adjust the length of this muscle tendon unit because the muscles are attached here to the thigh and the Achilles tendon is touched on the lower part to the heel, there's no way to actively shorten, at least in an extended position, to shorten the distance from the insertions of the muscles here to the point where the tendon is attached to the bones. So that means if the muscle is shortening, if the muscle size is getting smaller, directly the tendon will be stretched. That means if we have a muscle activation, it means an immediate stretching of the tendon. And think of the tendon as a rubber band, as in this example. If a tendon is stretched, the same effect as we are stretching a slingshot. Yeah, we're increasing the power. If you're using a slingshot, yeah, as harder you pull it away from the sling itself, from the shot itself, sorry, yeah, as more tension are you generating. And that's exactly the same with our muscle tendon movement. So think of your tendon as a slingshot, and if you're increasing the tension of the sling, it will enable you to accelerate the stone or whatever you want to fire away a bit further. Yeah, so if we have more muscle contraction, we will also have a more stretching of the tendon, and that allows us to store more energy, which will be beneficial during the following concentric muscle movement. So we need to utilize the stretch reflect, which is always a so-called involuntary movement, to keep the ground contact short. Yeah, stretch shortening cycle highly depends on the stretch reflex of the tendons. Yeah, remember, the muscle is contracting, the tendon gets stretched, and as a stretch reflex, we know that additional strength will be added to the concentric movements in the second part of our movements. So to have an improved quality of our stretch reflex, to store even more energy in our tendons, we need to focus on the eccentric phase of the movement. And we need to avoid plantar flexion. And you can all try this at home right now. So you can sit at your chair, that's no problem. And I just want you to touch your own Achilles tendon. Yeah, take your fingers and touch your Achilles tendon. So if you go for plantar flexion, if you're extending your ankle, your toes pointing down, and you touch your Achilles tendon, you will feel there's very little pressure around the tendon. There's almost zero tension. Now, if you go for dorsiflexion, yeah, you can see that out of the sudden, we feel a lot of tension at our Achilles tendon. Yeah, so just take your fingers, touch your Achilles tendon, and go for plantar flexion, followed by a dorsiflexion. And you will immediately see that we have much more tension in our tendon when we are focusing on the dorsiflexion, when the toes are looking up. And this is one of the reasons why we have to avoid plantar flexion, because we want to pull our sling. We want to increase the energy which is stored in our tendon. That only works if we maintain in a dorsiflex position. The reason for that is that the calf muscle is a so-called biarticular muscle. It is covering two joints, the knee joint and the ankle joint. Yeah, so if you want to improve your ground contact, we need to focus again on the eccentric phase of the movement, and we need to ensure that we are focusing on a dorsiflexion and that we avoid plantar flexion. And I will show you one example, because I know that a lot of coaches are using such an exercise, heel raisers, seated calf raisers like this to strengthen the calf muscle. But that's actually exactly the wrong way, because this is not the way our athletes are running or jumping. So we need to avoid a situation where our athletes are applying a lot of strength while being on their toes. Maybe you remember the presentation regarding speed training when we talked about the credit card rule. Credit card rule that the heels are very close to the ground and that we have a very small angle between the sole of the foot and the ground. Yeah, and that's exactly the opposite to this position. Another disadvantage of being far on your toes is that you're destabilizing the ankle joint. If you remain in a dorsiflex position, you can actually feel that the ankle joint is more stable in comparison to such a dorsiflex position. So if you're conducting strength training for your calf muscle, which definitely makes sense, we should focus on a different way. And we have to find, for example, eccentric ways to do so. And I will show you a short video. I hope the quality is good enough. Yeah, I will play it again. And have a look. The focus here is on the eccentric part. And you can see that the athlete is conducting the concentric part with both legs to reduce the load, because again, the emphasis is on the eccentric movement. And then she's slowly lowering the weight, because we know if you want to affect the muscle and the tendon during eccentric movement, we have to go for slightly longer contractions, usually 3 to 4 seconds at least. So this is already a bit too short here. But the amount of videos during the lockdown is also a bit limited. So the athlete is conducting the concentric phase, and she's raising the weight with both legs to reduce the load, because she's focusing on the eccentric movement, lowering the weight with one leg. And you can also see she's standing on the weight plate, so that we slowly or slightly overstretch the Achilles tendon and the calf muscles. And that's exactly the way we need the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscle in a sprinting or jumping movement. So we have to imitate this in strength training as well. Personally, I would also avoid to do seated calf raises with a bended knee joint, because this will have an impact on your calf muscles as well. Remember, the calf is a biarticular muscle covering both joints. And if you want to train a biarticular muscle, you have to ensure that we are locking one joint. If you are bending the knee joint, there will be very little tension, especially on the gastrocnemius, and that might be slightly unfortunate. It's the same if you want to train the hamstring muscles, for example. The hamstring muscle also is a biarticular muscle covering the hip joint and the knee joint. The hamstrings are extending the hip joint, but at the same time, they are bending the knee joint. That means whenever you train this muscle, we should lock the knee joint. And it's the same with the calf muscle, because it's bending the knee joint and extending the ankle joint. So we should always conduct calf strength training with an extended knee position. So regarding the dorsiflexion here, I found a nice video of Malaika Mihambo, the current world champion. She did 7.30 meters at the recent world championships in Doha 2019. And I just want you to have a look on her ankle joint and the dorsiflexion. And you will see that she's showing a very, very good dorsiflexion throughout the stride cycle and even during the takeoff. That was a bit too fast. Now, again, in slow motion, watch the dorsiflexion. You can very well see the sole of her spikes, a nice indicator for a proper dorsiflexion. And she's doing that, again, to increase the stretch shortening effect in her muscle tendon unit of the calf muscle covering the ankle joint. Because with the toes looking up, we are pre-stretching the Achilles tendon, and that helps us to apply more energy to the ground. So really avoid any kind of plantar flexion with your athletes and ensure they're always maintaining in a dorsiflex position, as coaches Raj Mohan and Nagesh already pointed it out in their drill session for the sprinting or running drills. And this dorsiflexion is really one of the essential technical aspects we already have to introduce to the very young athletes in the age of 8, 9, 10. Because it's much easier to teach such a technique correctly from the very first beginning rather than reteaching it after a few years or even months of training. Keep the dorsiflexion. So, when we're talking about jumps, we need to discuss the so-called impulse. Because the impulse eventually is propelling your body forward. And here you can see a very nice chart from a scientific paper, which was comparing the quality of different drop jumps. And on the lower part, you can see the drop jump performance. We have a drop jump from a small box, and this is the skeleton of the leg. So the leg muscles of the right leg, for example, you can see the hip here, the thigh, the lower part, the foot. You see the athlete is dropping down, bending the knee. That's the knee. That's what we call it. Lowering the body center of mass. So we're dropping down. We're lowering the body center of mass, and we are bending our hip joint, knee joint, and ankle joint. And this dropping, the vertical displacement of the body center of mass, including the bending of hip, knee and ankle joint, that's what we call amortization. And once we reach the highest amortization, the lowest point of our body center of mass, that's when the concentric part takes over. And when we are accelerating the weight, our body center of mass vertically again. And you can see here we have a landing phase and a takeoff phase. Yeah, the landing phase lasts until the end of the amortization. And once we're raising our body center of mass, that's when we start the so-called takeoff phase. And what we can see here is a performance during a drop jump. And these scientists, they measured the so-called ground reaction force, GRF, ground reaction force, during the ground contact of such a drop jump. On the x-axis, we see the time in milliseconds, and here the duration the athlete was spending on the ground was 320 milliseconds. And I can already tell you that this was actually not a very fast athlete. If you conduct such a drop jump test with a world-class sprinter or long jumper, we often see a duration of probably 130, maybe 140 milliseconds. Yeah, that means this athlete was relatively slow. And yesterday I mentioned that this duration and the impulse during this duration is an indicator for the talent of an athlete, yeah, or the amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. Again, it's almost impossible to measure the amount of fast twitch muscle fibers because it will be different for the soleus muscle than it is for the gastrocnemius muscle, and it will be different for the calf muscle than it is for the quadriceps, and different for the legs in comparison to the arms. Yeah, it's very, very individual. It's not the same distribution throughout our body. But here we can see a short duration, and if an athlete is able to apply a huge or generate a huge impulse to apply a lot of force within a short duration, this is the so-called ground reactive strength index, and that is a very good indicator on how fast our athletes are able to apply strength to the ground, and that highly depends again on the slow twitch fibers. But so here we see the ground reaction force, the vertical force. Yeah, how much force is applied vertically? And let's say we have a very young athlete here. The force he's exceeding is around 5,000 Newton. Yeah. We have different phases. We have two small spikes. The first spike here is when the toes are touching the ground, and this first spike occurs when the so-called metatarsophalangeal joint is touching the ground. That's the joint of your toes. And then we have a second spike here. That's when your heel is touching the ground. So this is when the most force is actually applied. Yeah, and then afterwards, we see after takeoff, this force is slowly decreasing. And the impulse then is described as a product of force over time. So if we multiply the applied force times the time we are spending on the ground, that's when we increase the impulse. And this impulse is a limiting factor actually for all athletics events. We need to create a huge impulse during our takeoffs, and that applies to sprinting movements, to running movements, to jumping movements, and even in the throws. So in athletics, we have one disadvantage, because we know that we have to increase the impulse. And again, the impulse means force multiplied by time. But at the same time, we know that better jumpers or faster sprinters also show shorter ground contact times. So we have to increase the impulse, and at the same time, we need to reduce the ground contact time. And the dilemma we are facing is that if you, of course, reduce T, yeah, which means the ground contact time in this formula, it directly has a negative impact on your overall impulse. But we know we need a larger impulse. So what do we have to do? To increase our impulse and to reduce the ground contact at the same time, there's only one way. And that means we need to generate more force. Yeah, so we have two options here. We need a so-called increased rate of force development, RFD, rate of force development. And that simply means how much force we are able to develop within a certain amount of time. And you can see the red dashed line here. This is the so-called rate of force development. If we see the maximum ground reaction force and we measure the time, how long it takes to reach this maximum ground reaction force. And this is one major difference between world-class athletes and, let's say, national class athletes, yeah, or between national class athletes or a medal winner at Open Nationals or Federation Cup and probably a semifinals. That these athletes who are faster, who are stronger, they usually are able to reach this maximum strength peak within a shorter amount of time. That means the dashed line would not be like this. It would be a bit steeper. And that means faster athletes usually have a higher rate of force development. They are able to generate force in a faster way. And another biomechanical parameter for those of you who are interested in that is the so-called average impulse. If we take this impulse and we divide it by the duration, yeah, then we have the average impulse, and better athletes are able to show higher average impulses. This rate of force development, by the way, is also used nowadays by sports scientists, by biomechanists, to give an indication about the fatigue of the central nervous system. So there are training groups all around the world who are, before the training session starts, they're performing one drop jump, for example, or a vertical depth jump, maybe just 2 or 3 repetitions, but they see how steep this rate of force development curve actually looks like. And if you see on a good day, it might be like this, you know, okay, obviously the athlete is very sharp, the central nervous system is fully recovered, and you can start a strength session. If, let's assume, this dashed line would look like that, yeah, and we say, okay, obviously today the rate of force development is a bit lower because you had an intensive speed session or an intensive strength session the day before, then you know the central nervous system is still a bit tired, so it makes probably sense not to conduct an intensive session at this day. Yeah, so this rate of force development, the red dashed line here, gives us a good indication about the central nervous system recovery of our athletes as well. And hopefully in a few years' time, we will also be able to utilize such measurements in India. Yeah, here's an example of a drop jump. You will see that this athlete has not a perfect dorsiflexion during the ground contact because she's still in a learning process. She's one of the athletes who have to be retaught. But you can see she's starting, toes are up. Yeah, there's a little too much bending in her ankle joint and knee joint, and then the landing on the next box. Yeah, once again, we want to keep the ground contact here as short as possible to generate a huge impulse. And at the same time, we also want to avoid any bending of the knee joint. So if you're capturing a slow motion video of your athletes whilst conducting these drop jumps, always ensure that your ankle joints are stiff, that the athletes maintain in the dorsiflex position, and avoid any bending of the knee joint. You can see this athlete is very strong at her hip joint, but her knees are slightly bended. That means she's dealing with a slightly bigger amortization. It's not bad, but it's not yet perfect, because there's still some work to do. Yeah, so avoid the amortization to keep the ground contact times short, because larger amortization always goes along with an increased ground contact time. And then, of course, you can conduct the next jump. Yeah, another opportunity is to do repetitive drop jumps. Yeah, and just watch these athletes. She's extremely quick. Also watch her knee angle. It maintains almost in a straight position. Yeah, there's very little amortization. So that's the way it's supposed to look like. With kids or junior athletes, don't use boxes which are higher than, I would say, 15 to 20 centimeters. Because if the height of the box is too large, you will definitely cause amortization, and then you're not training the stretch shortening cycle in the way it is supposed to be trained. If you have very experienced athletes, you can even do such exercises with a single leg. Only ensure ground contact times and avoid any amortization of the ankle joint, knee joint, and hip joint. Yeah, maintaining the dorsiflexion and ensure that the knee joint, ankle joint, and hip joint are fully extended to have short and quick ground contact times, because that's the way it has to be in all sprinting and jumping events. And I mentioned that these stretch shortening cycles, they do not only happen in the ankle joint regarding the Achilles tendon. Yeah, we can also find them for the patellar tendon, but the same also for the hip flexors. And one way to train the hip flexor to have a kind of drop jump for your hip joint might look like this. Yeah, the coach is softly but quickly pushing down the knee, and the athlete has to react. Yeah, so we're utilizing the stretch shortening cycle of the hip joint here. Yeah, the iliopsoas muscle, the psoas major and the iliacus, when you're extending your hip, they're pre-stretched. So there's energy again stored in the tendons and ligaments around these muscles. And during the recovery phase of the knee, of the leg, when the knee is moving forward, we can utilize this additional energy and we make our movement more effective. So by talking about the dorsiflexion, one video yesterday I mentioned that I want to show this with you, share this with you, sorry. We have to always work on the antagonists. Yeah, it does not make sense just to focus on making the gastrocnemius muscle and the soleus muscle and the Achilles tendon attached stronger. We also have to avoid this muscular disbalance. And that means we have to train the antagonist. And in this case, when it comes to the antagonist, we're talking about the shin muscle. That means mainly the tibialis anterior and the extensor hallucis and digitorum longus. That means the toe extensors. They help actually to avoid Achilles tendon injuries. And one way to do that is you attach like a strong or stiff rubber band to the toes, and you ask your athletes to dorsiflex, to bend their toes against the resistance of this band. Yeah, always ensure that there is a pressure on the band, never let it completely relax, and then ask the athletes to work against the resistance. And you can easily do 16 to 20 repetitions, maybe 2 to 3 sets with each side. And personally, I would advise you to do this at least 2 or 3 times a week. And I'm pretty sure you are able to reduce the amount of Achilles tendon injuries within your training group massively. Yeah, because we always, remember what Mr. Radhakrishna mentioned yesterday, we always have to avoid muscular disbalances in our body, and that includes training the antagonist to the calf muscle. In this specific case, I would always focus on including the so-called peroneus muscle, which is here a lateral muscle, because when we are touching down in the sprints or in the jumps, in the running movements, it's usually on the front outer part of our foot. An eccentric strengthening of the peroneus muscle also might help to prevent shin splint injury, which has been mentioned yesterday. Yeah, do this regularly. You can also do it in a seated position, sitting on a box, lifting some weights with the help of your toes and the ankle joint. So now we're getting a bit more specific. Let's discuss or have a look into few basic jump parameters. Yeah, and here we see an overview. It's the data is from one athletics book written by European authors Struder and Scholz. It's quite new. Unfortunately, it has not yet been published in English language, but I tried to translate a few things for you. Here, in the different columns, we have, the different rows. We have the 100-meter sprint, we have a takeoff into the hurdles, and then we have the pole vault, triple jump, hop, step, jump, the long jump, and the high jump. And we have data for female as well as for male athletes regarding the horizontal velocity, that means the run-up velocity immediately before the takeoff. We have the ground contact time and the takeoff angle. And you can see that in the 100-meter sprint, of course, the velocity is a bit higher, the horizontal velocity, in comparison to all jumps. At the same time, we have very, very short ground contact times. Yeah, sometimes less than 800ths of a second, on average, like 8 to 900ths of a second. When it comes to a hurdle takeoff, approaching the hurdle, the velocity, of course, is a bit reduced because, as James Siller mentioned it earlier, it's sprinting over the barriers and we will not be able to utilize our full maximum horizontal velocity. But still, you can see that we have very short ground contact times by taking off into the hurdle. And James mentioned the importance of the takeoff, yeah, to improve the quality of the takeoff when we are attacking the hurdle. So shorter ground contact times by approaching the hurdle are definitely a benefit, because it simply means that your athletes are able to generate a higher impulse, what we discussed earlier, within a shorter amount of time. So they have a higher rate of force development whilst entering the hurdle. In the pole vault, we have relatively slow run-up velocities, and the ground contact times are again quite fast, 10 to 1200ths of a second. In the triple jump, there is a certain variety. We have a couple of differences between male and female athletes, mainly according to the takeoff angle. But you can also see ground contact times are still relatively short. A bit shorter in comparison to the step and the jump, because over the duration of the triple jump, from hop to step to jump, you know that the horizontal velocity will be reduced from one jump to the other. Yeah, and that indicates the ground contact times are directly getting longer. But in the long jump, again, we have takeoff times of around 10 to 1300ths of a second. Top athletes maybe even a bit shorter. In the high jump, it's 14 to 1900 of a second, which means it's a relatively long ground contact, but that's again directly related to the steeper takeoff angle. So as steeper this takeoff angle is, we can already see as longer are the ground contact times. But independent from that, you can directly observe that the ground contact times in general are extremely short. And if you only have 0.1 of a second, 0.1 seconds to apply your power, your force to the ground, we directly understand the importance of a very high rate of force development to increase our impulse, to increase the amount of force we are able to apply, because this eventually makes the difference. And that's the reason why plyometric work is so important for our athletes, because again, plyometrics or jumping exercises, they are the link between maximum strength training and speed training for our athletes. Yeah, they are the link between strength and speed for our athletes, and they'll help us to better utilize our maximum strength and to ensure that we are able to apply our force within such a short amount of time. And I want to go a bit more into the detail to even underline the importance of this impulse. Here in this chart, you can see a comparison between female and male jumpers and their different target performances. And this is an overview generated by scientists, and they took the average performance data of female athletes who jumped 6 meters, 6 meters 35, or 6 meters 70, and for male athletes who jumped 7 meters, 7 meters 50, and 8 meters. Interesting to see here is how the different parameters are developing. And let's start with the horizontal velocity. We see, for example, that as farther women or men are jumping, as higher is their horizontal velocity. That implies a good long jumper needs to be a very fast sprinter. Also interesting to see is the contact time during the takeoff. And here for the women, it's not that evident, but we see for the men that a world-class long jumper covering 8 meters on average has a much shorter contact time than jumpers who only clearing 7 meters. Yeah, of course, it's only 1/100th of a second here, but if you compare 0.12 to 0.11 seconds, that's almost 10%. Yeah, so faster or better jumpers usually show shorter ground contact times during the takeoff. And that means lesser amortization, and they're able to apply more force. Another interesting parameter is the takeoff angle, because women as well as men are able to apply larger takeoff angle. That means their takeoff is more inclined. There is a higher vertical aspect to it. And this is one of the main differences between average jumpers and world-class jumpers, that they are able to increase their vertical takeoff velocity. And again, that's according to the vertical ground reaction force, yeah, the vertical impulse, as we've seen before. So we see that the ground contact time is getting shorter, still the vertical amount of force, the vertical takeoff velocity is increasing. And that again underlines the importance that better jumpers, and it's the same for throwers or for sprinters, better athletes in general are able to apply more force within a shorter amount of time. And that actually enables them to have a slightly greater loss of horizontal velocity, which is fine for them because they are approaching the board with a higher horizontal velocity. But interestingly, at the same time, they are also able to move their swing leg much faster. Yeah, the trail leg, the free leg. So you can see this is the velocity in a rate per second, that top athletes here are much faster when it comes to the swing leg or the free leg in comparison to their less gifted counterparts. So I already mentioned, yeah, if you want to reduce your ground contact times, if you want to increase the vertical takeoff velocity, we have to decrease the so-called amortization. And better jumpers and sprinters achieve a higher knee and ankle joint stiffness. That means there's less bending in the knee joint, less bending in the ankle joint. And that again results in lesser amortization and lesser oscillation. Oscillation just means the vertical movement of the body center of mass. Yeah, for a top sprinter, it's probably 4 or 5 centimeters going up and down. For an average sprinter or jumper, it usually looks like that. Yeah, so the waves are much higher. And again, I mentioned this already during the, I think the strength or the speed presentation. This is one advantage of amputee sprinters because of this prosthesis. They're actually able to achieve a higher stiffness, especially in the ankle joint, sometimes in the knee joint. That means they are losing less energy and they have a slight advantage in comparison to non-disabled athletes. But again, the underlying message here is we need to increase or decrease our amortization. We have to increase our stiffness. But stiffness, again, has nothing to do with flexibility. You can achieve a very high stiffness during the ground contact and you can still be a flexible athlete. So if you take all this into consideration, we have to ask ourselves, what are the requirements regarding the jumps? What are the determining factors regarding the quality of the jumps or plyometrics? And the quality depends on the following factors. First, of course, we have the horizontal run-up velocity. And I think you all know that in the jumps, it's not about the maximum velocity, it's about the optimum velocity. Because if a high jumper, like Tejas Shankar, for example, if he would approach the bar as fast as possible, he wouldn't have a chance to apply his power in a positive way, yeah, because he's not able to control this move. It's the same for a long jumper. The long jumpers, of course, they're approaching the board relatively fast, but definitely not as fast as they would have been in a 100-meter sprint, yeah, especially the younger athletes. In the triple jumps, it's even a bit slower because you need to have more control about your movement. Yeah, so we're always looking for an optimized horizontal run-up velocity. And that includes or is transferred into a proper takeoff angle, including the body's position, yeah, that we usually have a slight backward lean in all events, in the triple jump lesser in comparison to the long jump. We need to create a vertical impulse. And remember, in the long jump, and it's the same for the triple jump and the high jump, the vertical impulse, which is based on the rate of force development or the average impulse, becomes a limiting factor. And that's the same for a 400-meter athlete or even a marathon runner, for example. Again, if you see Eliud Kipchoge running on the last 2 kilometers of his marathon, you will see, or you will find, very little amortization. And that means he's able to increase his vertical impulse. It's the same for Mohamed Anas on the 400 meters. If he's approaching the final straight, yeah, he's a good finisher, he also is able to generate a high vertical impulse and to show less amortization. So plyometrics, especially in a slightly fatigued manner, becomes very important for 400-meter sprinters and middle distance runners, for example. At the same time, we need to optimize our ground contact times. Yeah, and we could see there are, of course, differences between sprinters and high jumpers. In the sprints, we usually have ground contact times below 1/10 of a second. In the high jump, it's slightly longer because we need to transfer more horizontal velocity into a vertical takeoff. Yeah, so we need to optimize them. But in general, you can say shorter ground contact times are definitely helpful. Yeah, if you compare world-class sprinters to maybe sprinters on a district level, you will always find that faster sprinters have shorter ground contact times. It's the same for a long jumper, triple jumper, even for a marathon runner. Yeah, world-class athletes in comparison to average or recreational athletes always having shorter and more efficient ground contacts. Yeah, and they also show a larger hip, knee, and ankle joint stiffness, which results in a reduced amortization. Again, that's the same for all athletic events. And of course, we need to improve the foot plant. Yeah, remember the dorsiflexion. And in all jumps, except the drop jumps, as you could see earlier, the contact always has to be on the whole sole. Now that means the contact should be on the midfoot. The problem is if you're touching down on the ball of your foot, yeah, in certain events, we have in the triple jump, for example, sometimes we have 13, 14 times the weight of the body acting in a vertical direction. Yeah, and if you touch down on the ball of your foot, there's no way that your ankle joint is able to tolerate this load. So the heel will sink to the ground, and once this is happening, you're increasing your ground contact time and you're reducing the tension of your tendon. Yeah, so always in the long jump, triple jump, pole vault, high jump, touch down on the whole sole. And only in the sprints or the middle long distance, we have the contact on the ball of the foot, including this credit card rule, because the vertical forces in the sprints are not as high in comparison to the jumps. In the sprints, we usually have maybe 3 times the body weight. Yeah, but again, in the triple jump, it's up to 13, 14 times the body weight. In the long jump, it's a bit less than high jump, and pole vault also slightly lesser. So these are the factors we always have to consider whilst talking about plyometrics. Horizontal run-up velocity, the correct takeoff angle, including the body position, generating a high vertical impulse is in a short amount of time. Yeah, to optimize these ground contact times, to increase the stiffness of our hip, knee, and ankle joint, and to ensure we have a foot plant on the whole sole, on the midfoot, with an exception of the drop jump. Other requirements, when we're talking about the jumps, we're usually talking about jumping higher or further. And this only depends on the takeoff angle and the angle of takeoff and the height of the center of mass. Yeah, or here COG means center of gravity. So the takeoff angle or takeoff velocity always is the sum of the vertical velocity and the horizontal velocity. So we always need to see how much horizontal velocity is necessary, how much vertical velocity is necessary, And during the takeoff, this will determine the velocity of our takeoff as well as the angle of our takeoff. And one important factor to know about the jumps, once your center of gravity, or once a body is in the air, we are not able to adjust the path of our center of gravity any longer. Yeah, once you are in the air, you cannot change the curve of the body center of mass because there's no external force applied to the COG. So the only way to improve the curve or the flight path of our COG happens during takeoff. And that's why we have to ensure we have a proper body position here. In the long jump, for example, we have a slide backward lean. And this slide backward lean means, okay, we're rotating around the foot. Let's say this is the foot. You're rotating around the foot. But once your body is in the air, it only rotates around the center of gravity. Yeah. As long as the foot is on the ground, we're rotating around this ground contact point. But once we're leaving the ground, the rotation only occurs around the center of gravity, and that means we don't have any chance to adjust the flight path any longer. The only thing we can do is to use our arms, for example, to counterbalance the leg movements to prepare for a proper landing as we see it in the long jump. Yeah, the body rotates around the center of gravity during the flight phase, and it can only be repositioned around the center of gravity, for example, in the long jump. So once we're taking off, you know, the center of gravity, this curve cannot be changed. But if you are bringing your arms forward, for example, the legs trying to counterbalance this arm movement, and this might help you to prepare for a proper landing. Or in the high jump, yeah, if you want to have this hyperextended bridge position, yeah, you're bending your upper body. That allows you to keep your legs a bit lower, and then you're rotating in this bended position around the curve, and that enables some high jumpers to have the body center of mass or center of gravity even below bar. Yeah, and that is one of the main advantages of the Fosbury flop in comparison to the straddle or the scissor jump. But it's also a disadvantage when we're teaching the high jump. So by teaching or introducing the high jump, you should never focus on the Fosbury flop in the beginning. Always focus on the scissor jump or the straddle, because we need a more vertical movement. The takeoff has to be emphasized whilst introducing the straddle or the scissor jump. If you're introducing the Fosbury flop from the very first moment, there's a very high chance that your athletes are not focusing on the takeoff any longer, just on clearing the bar, and that will definitely disable us from creating a massive vertical impulse, as discussed before. So when we are discussing the training methods regarding these jumps, yeah, we in general have approximately, there are a bit more, but I try to simplify it a bit, 6 different training methods. We have so-called isometric jumps, we have repetitive vertical jumps, repetitive horizontal jumps, then we have vertical depth jumps, speed bounding, and drop jumps. And I will try to give you a short idea, a short overview about all these training methods, what makes them special, and also when to use them. Apologies for the videos, they're not always the best quality, but yeah, again, we didn't have a chance to record some more videos because our national athletes are also not yet allowed to train. So let's start with isometric jumps. Isometric jumps means we're actually not focusing on the ground contact, on a quick ground contact. Instead, we are more working on the stiffness. Yeah? So the focus of isometric jump is more on the stiffness and to have and kind of anatomical adaptation, that the body slowly gets used to jumps work. And that's the reason why we conduct it in general preparation, and we have a low horizontal speed, a low vertical speed, and the impact on the central nervous system is also not that high, but we have a high structural load. Yeah, and structural load means a load on the ligaments, on the bones, on the joints. And this load with jumps is always very high. And that's the reason why we should actually give our athletes at least 2 to 3 days to recover from such high structural loads. Yeah, so usually we say following a structural load, you need around 48 hours of recovery. If it's very intensive plyometric work, maybe even longer. And I will show you a few videos here. The first one, so-called sumo jumps. Yeah, the athlete tries to keep the hip low. At the same time, she's raising her knees. So this is an activation for your glute muscles, for your adductors, very effective method for the beginning of the season. Just ensure that your knees are always pointing towards the toes. Yeah, another, a tuck jump is an isometric landing afterwards. Yeah, so the athlete is trying to tuck the knees under, and during the landing, she's told to freeze. Once again. Yeah, she's tucking the knees under her body and then trying to land in an almost fully extended position, and she's asked to freeze, and therefore isometric landing. And you can see she's doing very well landing on the midfoot. That means the whole sole is in contact with the ground. Yeah, another kind of isometric jumps. The execution here is not 100% isometric, but you can do that and just ask your athletes to land and freeze. Yeah, so that there's no movement any longer once the feet are touching the ground. One last example you can do, for example, doing even using some Swiss balls, including a little balance problem here at the end. Yeah, but the idea is to jump on the ball and to freeze. That's also isometric jump work, which you usually do at the beginning of the season to get the muscles and the joints, the ligaments, the active and the passive structures, get used them to the load. So this is usually followed by so-called repetitive vertical jumps. Yeah, and here the focus is on the vertical impulse. We do it in general preparation, beginning of special preparation. Again, the horizontal speed is relatively low. Central nervous system load is medium. Structural load, again, is high. And the vertical speed is medium to high. And I think you all know these hurdle bounds, for example. And we can here see a relatively nice execution, especially if you watch, if you watch the first hurdles. And watch this athlete, her feet are moving backwards. So she's pulling herself forward. That's exactly the way it should be. But you can also see that after the fifth hurdle, she's already getting a bit tired. And it makes no sense to conduct plyometrics any longer if the athlete is getting tired. And we see in a lot of cases that coaches are using this kind of hurdle bounds and they put 10, 12, 15 hurdles in a row. And I guarantee you, you're making your athletes slow by doing so. If you do this hurdle bounding, restrict it to 6 or 8 hurdles, give them a little rest, yeah, and go for more sets in between instead. But having 10 or 12 hurdles in a row, there's a lot of scientific evidence indicating or making it very clear that this actually is increasing the ground contact time. So we're doing, again, the opposite of what we are intending to do. And therefore, keep the number of repetitions low. If your add is a bit more rest and increase the number of sets instead, this will help you to increase the vertical impulse and the rate of force development. Yeah, because remember, it's not about jumping 15 hurdles. It's about jumping or clearing as many hurdles within as little time as possible. Keep the ground contacts short. And if you see your ground contact times are increasing, you better stop your plyometric training. Yeah, you see here the last 2 hurdles, performance is not that nice any longer. Or another opportunity here, a bit too slow, yeah, and there could be even more vertical action, but this is something you could use to improve the vertical aspects as well. So after developing the repetitive vertical jumps, we have a smooth transition into repetitive horizontal jumps. And the focus here for the first time now is to generate a higher horizontal impulse. That means forward orientated. And we do this in special preparation and beginning of pre-competition. The horizontal speed is increasing. Yeah, we are following the principle from slow to fast. The load on the central nervous system becomes a bit higher because of the velocity. Structural load, again, is still high. And the vertical speed now is a bit reduced. And I think you all know this simple bounding. Or even single leg movements. Here in slow motion. Yeah, and you can see very nice execution here on the right side. The ground contact, despite the dorsiflexion, is on the midfoot. That means there's very little braking of this athlete. And there's extremely little amortization. Yeah, you see during the ground contact, she's not really lowering her body center of mass, only very little bit. She's still a young girl. But this is already very nice execution, which helps you to improve your stiffness as well as your jumping abilities and your power at the same time. So then these repetitive horizontal jumps are followed by vertical depth jumps. And that's something where we focus on the vertical impulse. And here, the focus is really on a very short ground contact time. We want to apply as much force as possible within as little time as necessary. Yeah, and that's something we're usually doing in pre-competition phase and competition phase. Again, the horizontal speed here is a bit lower. Central nervous system load is very high because it's extremely intensive, a high structural load, and the vertical speed also is extremely high. I think you all know this young boy. Yeah, he's adding another drop off after the landing. So very nice execution here. He's dropping down from a box, very quick movement. You see the height of his body center of mass, followed by another quick jump, yeah, just to work on the second vertical impulse. Very great execution. Yeah. Another sprinter here. And immediately trying to fully extend the knee again. One variation is conducting the same exercise, but with a medicine ball in your hands, in between your arms, for example, like this. Yeah, to increase the explosiveness. But please keep in mind that every additional weight slows your body down. Yeah, so that means using this medicine ball will definitely increase the length of your ground contact. So this is probably an exercise we do in the beginning of pre-competition, yeah, because we don't want to sacrifice even a single % of speed when it comes to the end of pre-competition or the competition phase, where the focus is mainly on speed. Yeah, but these are all exercises to help you developing this quick vertical impact, which we need, as you've seen in the long jump, for example, but the same in the triple jump, in the high jump. High jump is often doing it with a single leg, even, and also for the sprints. Yeah, because if you reach your maximum running velocity, for example, there is very little need to further increase the horizontal. Then it's more about maintaining your horizontal impulse, your maximum horizontal velocity. Yeah? And vertical aspects become more important. So along with these vertical depth jumps in pre-competition phase and competition phase, we're using so-called speed bounding. Yeah, and here the focus is on both the horizontal and vertical impulse, but again, with very short ground contact times. And again, one video of Shishankar, like a typical 5-step bounding test. I think he did 23 meters something or so, which is a very good performance. Yeah, you see there's still a bit of amortization with each of his steps. Yeah, we're increasing the speed we have, and that's the main difference. When it comes to speed bounding, we are adding a lot of horizontal velocity, active foot plant, and again, you can see perfect dorsiflexion, and the touchdown is on the midfoot. That's a very nice execution here. Very quick swing leg. And because we have slightly more time now, he's using a double arm swing in comparison to single arm swing in the long jump. Here you see a world-class sprinter. I think some of you have watched a video during the running technique session. Yeah, but it's a similar test. I think it's a 5-step bounding into the sand pit to reduce the impact during the landing a bit. I think she has a personal best of 22.6 and 11.02 on 100 meters. Yeah, so you see these are very common plyometric training methods. And now, of course, the question is, how do we combine these training methods within a training year? And on the top, you can see the different phases from general preparation towards special prep, pre-competition and competition phase. And you have an overview when to utilize this different jump training methods. So we start in general preparation, as I mentioned, with isometric jumps. Yeah, then we have a smooth transition into repetitive vertical jumps. Afterwards, we are adjusting this towards the horizontal jumps. For the high jumpers here, sometimes it's a bit different. They are not focusing too much on the horizontal jumps, but they are trying to increase the velocity in between their takeoffs. For example, if they do 3 takeoffs in a curve with 5 steps in between, yeah, maybe in the beginning of the season, they're having a relatively low horizontal velocity, or they only do 3 steps in between. When they're coming closer to the competition season, they are increasing the horizontal velocity in between different takeoffs, or they're increasing at the same time, they can increase the number of strides. And instead of takeoffs with 3 steps in between, you're going for 5 steps or even 7 steps in between, just to have shorter ground contact. And afterwards, we have a smooth transition again into the vertical depth jumps in pre-competition phase and competition phase, combined with speed bounding. Yeah, because here with the vertical depth jumps, we're increasing the vertical aspect, which is important for all our events. But at the same time, we want to utilize the speed bounding to apply more strength within the short contact times. And the drop jumps to improve the stretch shortening cycle of our ankle joint and the Achilles tendon. That's something we can already start alongside all the other jump training forms in special preparation, sometimes already in general preparation. But don't do too much of it. And here you can find just a brief overview on what I suggest to do, how many repetitions you need. For the drop jumps, overall, in the age of 16, 18, and 20, you can probably increase it from 20 to 25 and 30. But I guarantee you, even world-class athletes are usually not performing more than 30 drop jumps, because we've realized, or scientists have actually figured out, that if you're having more than 25 or 30 drop jumps, your central nervous system is not any longer able to cope with such an intensive load, and the ground contact times are going to be increased. And so if you're conducting more than 25 or 30 drop jumps within a session, there's a high chance that your athletes are actually getting slower. And that's the reason we are breaking it down. For example, you can go for 6 sets of 4 repetitions, a short rest in between. Some coaches, they utilize the rest in between to conduct a few running drills, to have a dry back transition from the jumping related movement into the more technical drills. When we're talking about isometric jumps, the ones for general preparation, you can slowly increase it from 100 to 125, 150. And one example to conduct is that you have, for example, 4 different exercises. You go for 8 repetitions each and 4 sets of these 4 different exercises with a short rest in between. When it comes to repetitive vertical jumps, like hurdle bounding, for example, with beginners, of course, we use small hurdles or maybe even boxes. and not too many repetitions, because remember, the quality is more important than the quantity. We want to keep the ground context low and the vertical impulse high, so we can increase this until 80 in the years of 20. An example is 4 sets of 2 by 6 repetitions. Yeah, 6 repetitions, 2 sets, and a short rest before starting the next set. Horizontal jumps is almost similar. Usually we have slightly more repetitions because it depends a bit on the form, but if you do alternated jumps like right-left bounding, you can go for 12. If you restrict it to single leg bounding, maybe you limit the amount to 6 or 8 jumps in a row to keep the ground context short. When we're talking about vertical depth jumps, again, we have a very high intensity. We should not really do that at the young ages because, again, the growth plates are not yet fully closed. Yeah, the body might still be growing vertically. So we don't want to take a risk. But with under 18 athletes, maybe up to 10, with under 20, up to 15 jumps in one session, and you can break it down, for example, 4 sets of 3 vertical depth jumps. And speed bounding, the same principle applies. It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality of the jumps. So we keep the overall number relatively low. Instead, we're breaking it down into different sets, for example, 6 sets of 5 repetitions, but with a relatively long rest in between. Here you can easily give them 3-4 minutes rest, because this speed bounding also includes a short run-up. So when teaching all these jumps, again, we always have to ensure that quality supersedes quantity, that we focus on a proper takeoff, including, of course, the run-up action. We need to increase the frequency towards the takeoff. We have to focus on the hip extension and the lead leg action. And just to give you a very quick example, a few videos I found how to do that, even for world-class athletes. Here, for example, some isometric work on how to focus on the takeoff. It's about the posture, the foot plant, and a very quick trail leg or swing leg action at the same time. And that's something you can do with all age groups, not necessarily on a hard surface. If you have a plain grass track, for example, do it on the grass. The next step would be, the next step would be to include some arm movement and increase the horizontal velocity. A very challenging new muscular drill. Yeah, so definitely not easy. Very nice execution here, good hip extension, even though Srishankar shows a bit of amortization with his left leg. Then we are increasing the distance in between, focusing a bit more on the transition with a very high frequency. And that's something he's doing extremely well here. Very quick steps. These are rhythmical jumps, but of course also having an impact on his plyometric strength before eventually going to the sandpit. And here you see the run-up speed is increased. So horizontal velocity is increasing. Again, we're following the principles from slow to fast, developing a proper rhythm. Yeah. There was one session, one question yesterday, which I wanted to include, bounding uphill. And I hope that you already gathered some ideas to answer this question for yourself. When we're bounding uphill, we're actually reducing the vertical displacement, the falling height. Yeah, if you're jumping uphill, your body center of mass is not dropping down that much because your landing point is higher than your takeoff point. And that already means we are decreasing not only the vertical displacement, but we are also decreasing the muscle activation. Yeah, because it does not need that much strength for the muscle to overcome, to resist this amortization or the vertical displacement. Yeah, that means the overall force or the impulse which is applied during uphill bounding is reduced. And therefore, the emphasis is more on a concentric muscle action, which means a reduced utilization of the stretch shortening cycle, or the stretch shortening reflex. Yeah, and we are not actually developing the specific strengths we want to develop. So for uphill bounding, and it's the same for ascent bounding, that's why I use this picture, is more focusing on the concentric action. But remember one of my first slides, in athletics, the focus should always be on the eccentric part of the movement. So you can use slightly higher volumes by conducting this uphill bounding, but it might even cause a hypertrophy for the slow twitch fibers because you have very long ground contact times. Yeah, by uphill bounding, I don't think there's any chance to stay below 150, 160 milliseconds of ground contact. And that means we're not developing these fast movement patterns any longer. So the only way to do that is to use it in general preparation. We know that especially in the former Soviet training regime, a lot of this uphill bounding or bounding in general was done. Often they had sessions with 500, 600 or even more jumps within one session. And they tried to use this training method actually to increase the stiffness of the ankle joint and the knee joint. Nowadays, we know that we don't need such a high volume because it's way more efficient if you conduct isometric or eccentric strength training, for example, for your senior athletes after the age of 18, 19. Because this isometric or eccentric training will help you to increase the stiffness of your tendons. It will therefore help you to improve the quality of your stretch shortening cycle without using a high volume in training. And that definitely reduces the risk of injuries. Because if you are doing a lot of jump work, yeah, you're definitely increasing the risk of injuries, and it's not guaranteed that you will actually fulfill your aim of increasing the stiffness. And in general, when we're talking about jumps, always follow the basic principles from slow to fast, general to specific, simple to complex, and known to unknown. And for the experienced coaches among you, that's the last slide, just to quickly point it out, your reactive strength capacity, yeah, the quality of your muscle tendon unit, the length, the stiffness, always has an impact on your takeoff time. How long is the ground contact? We know we want to shorten this ground contact by reducing the amortization, reducing the braking, etc. But your reactive strength capacity directly gives you an idea of your takeoff time. And therefore, is this reactive strength capacity a good indicator of your talent? So more talented athletes usually have a higher reactive strength capacity. Then this takeoff time, on the other hand, determines your technique as well, especially regarding the takeoff and the preparation. For example, in the long jump, in the high jump, we've seen some high jumpers, they show 12 or 30 millisecond ground contact times. Others, they have 18 or 1900 of a second ground contact time. Yeah, so this is a huge difference. So the quality of your reactive strength capacities and the takeoff time also gives you a kind of idea what technical model you have to apply to your athlete, especially in the triple jump and the high jump. If you have an athlete with a longer takeoff time, he definitely has to use a slightly different technique in comparison to an athlete with a very short takeoff time. Yeah, because this will be, and this has an implication on your takeoff preparation as well as the free elements. And that again has an impact on your approach velocity. So for all the high jump coaches, if you have an athlete with relatively long takeoff times, you don't necessarily need to force them to approach the bar with an extremely high velocity. They might even need a lower velocity to apply more force due to a longer takeoff and to the requirement of having more time available for the repositioning of the swing elements during the flight phase or the preparation phase. Okay, that's it. Sorry, it got a bit longer than expected. So, if there are any questions?
Beforehand, thank you, Mr. Walter. I request President Athletic Federation of India is available here. He like to add something, sir?
Thank you, Volker. Very, very interesting session today. There are so many new things that I learned, and there are so many things I did wrong when I was running. I wish we had this sort of scientific knowledge in my days. We did 99% of the things, and our plyometrics or whatever we thought we were doing was completely wrong and actually counterproductive. So I'm thankful to you, and I'm thankful that so many coaches have joined today. There were 800 plus, and I wish they can take back something. At least if it's not helping, it's not going to be counterproductive, because all that we were doing in our days was everything counterproductive to what science is saying today. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very enlightened session. There are lots of questions that I can see. There are lots of questions that I can see on the chat. Maybe you can take some, maybe you want to reply to them by email separately. But do reply to them, because some very, very good questions. There are people with conflicting views. I am very happy to have a conversation, but that has to be done offline. For every scientific theory, there is a counter-scientific theory. So there would be, I could see some counter views and counter views on the chat. Please keep that private. Please, my request is that you can privately also discuss with Volker, Radha, or whoever you want. But it's good that so many questions are coming up, and I want to thank. There are people here from Sri Lanka. There are the Secretary of Bangladesh, and from Bangladesh, Valerie was here today. I'm not sure whether she's still here. Valerie, the multiple world champion, Olympic champion, has sat through this session today. So there are many people also from out of India, and we welcome everybody who would like to join. It's our job to sort of educate, to disseminate information to the best of our knowledge. And thank you, Volker, for taking care and taking the pain to set this up. Thank you, Radha, and your team. So Raj Mohan and everybody else. So thank you very much. And
it's a pleasure.
Please carry on with your question answer session.
Thank you, sir. Now I request Raj Mohan to come out with the questions. First, switch on your microphone.
I can't hear you. I think your mic is not on.
Can I start a question? There was a question from Mr. Nishad Kumar, who was a senior coach in jumps. What is the ratio of anterior and posterior muscles of lower leg?
The ratio?
Yeah, what is the ratio of anterior and posterior muscles of lower leg?
Yeah, again, I think we discussed this in detail yesterday, that the anterior chain and the posterior chain, they usually have a ratio of, if you compare the concentric strengths of 70 to 100, if you compare the strength part of the hamstrings to the concentric part of the quadriceps, it should be 1 to 1. Again, the prime movers are definitely the glutes and the hamstrings. So this is where our focus has to be. In the jumps, again, the quadriceps is, in the jumps, the quadriceps has slightly different function because it's stabilizing the knee joint during the ground contact. But again, I won't overemphasize on the quadriceps.
Okay, the other question is, how can we reduce the force development time? That means to increase the RFD, that is reduce the force development time.
Yeah, the rate of force development.
Yeah.
Yeah, that depends on your training methods, of course. And in your training, you should always consider that in the end, it has to be a very fast movement, because you've seen the ground contact times are relatively short. Yeah, and to generate your maximum strength takes usually around a second, maybe even longer. So in athletics, we don't have this time. You know, we are not weightlifters. So we have to apply our force in as little time as possible, and that requires slightly different training methods. Not throughout the season, but especially when we're coming closer to the pre-competition or competition phase, we need to focus on the speed aspects. And we need to maintain our maximum strength, but the focus has to be on power and speed strength, and of course, including plyometrics. And that also helps to improve this rate of force development. We just have to make our athletes fast, not only regarding the horizontal velocity, but in every way possible.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. How about bounding downhills? Because you described that the uphill bounding is that not be encouraged. Then how about bounding downhills? Will it help anyway?
Yes, that's a good question, and I didn't bring it up earlier in my presentation, because jumping downhill, this is a training method which we should not apply to athletes below the age of 21 or 22, because we have a very high impact on the central nervous system, as well as a high structural load. And if an athlete does not have the necessary experience, not the necessary quality, there's a very high chance that we are literally destroying them. Yeah, so destroying the anatomical structures. And
Okay, thank you, Walker. Rajmohan?
Sir, I have some questions, sir. Sir, what age we can start the plyometric exercises? You have mentioned about under 16 and above. We can start the training from 10 or 12 years or 14 years of a boy or girl.
Yeah, I think you should, with plyometrics, you should start as early as possible. Yeah, it just depends. This is saying the dose makes the poison. You don't have to do like hundreds of jumps. Yeah, but if you ask your kids to do 4 small, even jump-orientated games, that's absolutely fine. And again, we should try to teach the proper takeoff technique. We can do this already in the age of 7 or 8, if possible. Yeah, just don't overstress them. So keep the volume relatively low. That should be all right then, but let's start doing it as early as possible, but in a joyful way. Yeah, a structured plyometric training, that's something I would probably start in the age of 14, 15. But before that, definitely expose the kids to plyometrics, use plyometric training methods to improve this quality of your stretch shortening cycle.
Thank you, sir. So
you can also, sorry, if you do ball games, basketball, volleyball, whatever, yeah, this is also, or can also become a kind of plyometric training.
Thank you, sir. Sir, can you elaborate the plyometric training for middle and long distance runners?
Yeah, there was a very, a question from Uresh Pawar. I think he had a couple of questions yesterday already, and I think, you know, it's one thing to read a lot of scientific articles, it's another thing of whether you understand them. And as coaches, we always have to apply our knowledge, and we also have to learn from experience. And I can assure you that endurance runners nowadays, they're doing a lot of work to improve the quality of the central nervous system. Yeah, they're conducting maximum strength sessions, especially 800-meter runners and middle distance runners in general. They are conducting a lot of plyometric training as well, because this is a crucial ability, especially at the end of the race. Yeah, most of the decelerations, they happen because the frequency of a runner is reduced. And the frequency is directly related to your ground contact as well as to your stiffness. And if you see Eliud Kipchoge running, yeah, you can see that he has a very high cadence. In the running events, we don't necessarily call it frequency, we call it cadence. So he has a very high cadence, very short ground contact times, very short touchdown distance, as we mentioned earlier. and very little amortization in comparison to any other runner. So this is definitely a requirement. And even the Kenyan runners, if you go to Eton or so, to the international training centers in Kenya, you can see they have gyms, and lots of them are doing regular gym work. So yes, definitely, I think runners have to do some plyometric work as well. It's just, of course, we have to be careful with the structural load, and we have to step by step build that up.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you told about the stiffness of the joints. Would it increase any risk in the injuries for the athletes?
Yeah, we discussed this yesterday. Stiffness has nothing to do with a lack of flexibility. The stiffness of a muscle just describes the ability to tighten, to strengthen the joint during the ground contact. Yeah, you can be extremely flexible. Yeah, you can do a split, whatever, but when it comes to the touchdown and takeoff, you have to ensure that there's very little movement in the ankle joint and the knee joint and the hip joint. The best example for this are probably not even athletes, but gymnasts. Yeah, if you see a gymnastic competition, there are a lot of bounding is involved in certain elements. Yeah, so these athletes are extremely flexible. At the same time, they have very stiff ankle and knee joints, which enables them to apply more force, more power to the ground. So stiffness has nothing to do with flexibility. We need a decent flexibility in our muscles, yeah, to increase a certain range of movement. At the same time, we need the ability to stiffen our joints at the right time. And that's mainly shortly before we hit the ground, it's the late ground preparation phase, or during the takeoff.
Thank you, sir. Sir, another question regarding stress shortening cycle. The improvement of stress shortening cycle ultimately improve the concentric movement, which leads to increase in height of the jump. Is it true or false? Stress shortening cycles?
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to say it improves in a certain way it does, but the best way to increase the efficiency of a stretch shortening cycle is by improving the eccentric phase. Yeah, because if you have a higher rate of force development during the eccentric phase, that means you are saving or you're storing more energy in your tendons. If you have a long eccentric phase, you can also store this energy. Yeah, but we in athletics want to have a short eccentric phase because this enables us to store more energy, and this energy then will be reutilized during the following concentric phase. Yeah.
Sir, another question is regarding the plyometric sessions. After plyometric sessions, what the coaches has to do with these athletes, or combining a plyometric section with another session or something like that. If you elaborate something regarding this, sir.
Yeah, after plyometric session, from my experience, I would not do anything afterwards. Give them some rest, let them do some stretching. That's it. You can easily combine, and that's something we will discuss, I think, at the end of this week. Yeah, when we talk about session planning, you can easily conduct, let's say, a weight session, free weights. Yeah, that you do some cleans, maybe power, speed, strength, and afterwards you do some plyometrics just to apply the strengths. But I would not necessarily do it the other way around, because remember, we always want to go from slow to fast. And the only movement which is faster than plyometrics is actually sprinting. But you don't necessarily want to sprint after plyometrics if the emphasis on plyometrics, because then your central nervous system will already be slightly fatigued, and you only do speed work if you're 100% recovered. So I think plyometrics should properly mark the end of a training session.
Thank you, sir. So last question is regarding the drop jumps, the height of the drop jumps, and what age we can start it. Can you explain a little bit about the drop jumps, height and distance?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I like that. I think you can start drop jumps also in the age of 12, 13. But you probably start with a very low height. Maybe even 5 centimeters is enough. If you just use a mat or a small wooden board, whatever. Yeah, because if the height is too high, if your athletes are dropping down from 40, 50 centimeters box, yeah, this will definitely increase the amortization. And this amortization then is increasing the ground contact time. And again, the number one ability of a good athlete is to apply a lot of force within a short amount of time. So we need to keep this amount of time, the duration, short. So with 15, 16-year-old athletes, you can probably progress to maybe a 15, 20 centimeter box. At the age of 20, probably around 30 centimeters. And with very senior athletes who have incredible capabilities, you can probably proceed with 40 centimeters, but usually that's it. There is the so-called reactive strength index, and there are different definitions for this reactive strength index, but one definition is that you calculate the ratio between the ground contact time and the flight time in a jump. Yeah, and based on this, you can also, or if you have a force platform, for example, you can calculate the power. And if you will see that if you choose the height too high, that the power will actually be reduced. So yeah, as a rule of thumb, with small kids use 5 to 10 centimeters in the age of 15, 16 centimeters, maybe 15, 16 years, 15 to 20 centimeters, around 20 years, maybe 30 centimeters. And if you're 24, 25, you can probably with some scientific guidance increase the height up to 40 centimeters or so.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. It was a very elaborating and explanatory session today. I think it was helpful for most of our coaches, not only jump coaches as well the sprint coaches, because everyone need to do plyometrics and depth jump, as you said, even for the middle and long distance runners also. So I once again thanks the participant, like our chief national coach. I'm finding every day in the session, as well as the Secretary General of Bangladesh and all the participants. I'd like to inform you, tomorrow there is no online session. We will be meeting only day after tomorrow. That is on Thursday, on 7th. We have a break day in between because you are also tired, we are also tired. So before concluding, Walker, you like to add something?
Thanks a lot. I hope you got some insights today, which you hopefully are able to apply into your training session. I think at least my colleagues promised me that they're going to upload all the presentations on AFI's website. So maybe in the afternoon or so, have a look at indianathletics.in to see whether you can already find the presentations, not only of today, but also the last days. And in addition, if there are questions, please feel free to write an email to education@indianathletics.in, because on the last day, next week, we will have a question answering sessions. And we will bring up some of these questions at the same time. Of course, we will also answer or reply to a few questions coming from your side. Thank you very much. We see you on Thursday. You get some rest and enjoy the day. Bye.
Thank you, Walker. I request now Mr. Parveer Singh, because I cannot find Mr. Kamal Ali Khan. So I'm making you as a host. So you can continue with your attendance procedure. Later you can end the meeting. Mr. Parveer Singh, are you available?